G'day all. When I painted the Revenant Legion previously, I chose the silver interpretation. However, several sources, and a few of you in the comments, suggest that the Legion may have worn a darker grey armour. So in this video, I'm exploring that alternative scheme. I'll put a link to the silver version's video in the description below. More on that at the end. So starting off, I based the model in a grey primer and layered a couple of watered down coats of Dawnstone from Citadel. Once again using a worn old brush just to get the paint down unevenly. As always, be sure to only apply the next coat once the previous is completely dry. Otherwise the paint won't set and you'll end up screwing up the model before you've even started. It should take only about 2 coats, but I did 3 for a strong solid colour. After that I moved to some matte black from Army Painter for most of the black areas of the model, so on all the rubber joints between the plating and the conduits on the legs. I then used some AK Interactive Smoke Black as the primary shade colour. I used it as a recess line shade, but also as a sort of glaze to stay in the areas of the armour nearest to the recesses. Sort of as a start to the weathering or grimy effect the Revenant were known for. So I kept the colour stronger for the line recesses, but then watered it to about a 2:1 ratio with water and stained it slightly with multiple passes. There wasn't really a rule of where or how much that I followed here for this, just wherever you feel it looks good really, plus it saves time not doing it everywhere. As I said, feel free to go as hard or as light as you want with it, it's up to you. Now here was just a quick touch up with Dawnstone again, over any areas that weren't smooth enough a transition in my opinion. Some areas required stronger coats where others just needed a light glaze. Now, I'm not really one for washes in recesses, but on the Revenant the grime sort of gave it a pass. I used non-oil in some selective areas and over areas I was going to make streaks of oil or grease. I then used some dark silver from Pro Acryl and layered it thinly over the trim of the armour. This is a beautiful silver, but don't water it down too much, it is already relatively thinned and smooth, so 1 coat, maybe 2 should do here. I decided to use some Basilicanum Grey contrast paint from Citadel as a shade for the silver. It was already about the tone I wanted, so this was just to give it a little bit more definition. But it was just a personal preference really, so feel free to use some non-oil here if you prefer. Back to the grey armour, I used Administratum Grey as a highlight and ran it along the edges of the armour. Now with this job I deliberately wanted the highlights to be a little messy, whilst adding some freehand run-off scratches, again setting up for the weathering simultaneously with the overall colour scheme. I find this to be a very forgiving way to edge highlight, as it really sped up the process, but also turning every non-perfect line into battle damage really killed 2 birds with 1 stone. So use a minimal amount of paint at a time, but avoid watering it down at all if possible. Still add moisture, but avoid it where possible so as to maintain strong control and also a solid colour first pass. As of how much is entirely up to you, but less is probably more in this instance, but it is also the Revenant, so go crazy if you want. And to complete the scratches, the larger ones were given a line of AK Smoke Grey directly opposite to the first line. This adds depth and a sort of realism to the damage. I then added some Agrax Earthshade from Citadel to the trim areas once the previous shade was dry, to give those areas a weathering, grimy look to tie in with the rest of the grey. Now starting on the bolt gun, I used AK Interactive's Oily Steel on all the metal areas and also on the areas on the power pack, before layering all the areas over again with non-oil. You could probably add a little bit of Agrax Earthshade in there too if you wanted to weather down the weapons, but that's entirely up to you. After that I moved to some cables found around the model, and for this I used Dirty Red from AK Interactive. For the casing on the bolt gun, I used Abaddon Black, then edge highlighted with Stegadon Scale Green from Citadel, before an even finer highlight of Dark Reaper. Looking back now, you could probably scratch up the weapons a bit too, using these colours the same way we did the armour. But if for some reason your lads took good care of their weapons too, I used some Dawnstone to spot highlight the sharpest areas, before moving back to the cable areas with Blood Red from AK Interactive. Since I had it on the palette still ready for use, I used Dark Reaper from before on the conduits where the light would reflect. The skull emblem was hit with some burnt tin from AK Interactive, as were the casings in the magazine, along with some of the areas on the backpack. You could paint these whatever colour you want. I had no basis really for it, I just had the gold out at the time and realised that they hadn't been painted yet. But I've committed to it now, so once the paint was dry I went over it with Agrax Earthshade. To get the red lenses prepared, I used Flesh Terror's red contrast paint and deepened the corners with Carroburg Crimson shade. And once that was dry, I ran a thin line of white across the front and covered it with Carroburg Crimson again. Now this part was inspired by a comment left by a hopefully subscriber on the Silver Versions video mentioning seeing bones painted on their plating. I thought it sounded pretty cool, so I wanted to add it to this model. So starting with Dark Grey from AK Interactive, I stenciled out an outline of the bone shape, keeping it thin so I can touch up with Dawnstone easily if I make a mistake. And then proceeding to fill in the rest of the shape with the Dark Grey. I then deepened the colour with some Death Reaper from 2 thin coats, leaving a bit of the Dark Grey outline, to give a sort of rough DIY look before going even further with Doom Death Black from 2 thin coats to give the final finished colour. It was great fun and a good first practice, so thank you again for the suggestion in the comments. I think it's a great addition to the scheme. For the blood, I like to keep it simple, so I use a mix of Army Painter's Strong Tone Wash and AK Interactive's Black Red. It gives a brownish dry blood sort of stain, but also acts as a heavy grease look once dried. Applied it in random patches all over the armour. And feel free to do as much of this or as little as you want. At this stage the blood looks great if it was dry and old, but if you wanted to add a little bit more freshness to it, then I whipped out some of the Citadel's technical paint, Blood for the Blood God. And with this paint I was pretty liberal and thick with it wherever I applied it. But mix it up a bit. You could probably do some areas as nice and fresh and others left dry from previous battles. It's entirely up to you. But I like to lean on the less is more area on this. And this is what I ended up with, my interpretation of the Grey Revenant. And just as a quick cameo and comparison of the silver variant done previously for the reference. And if you want to go check out that video and how it's done, I'll link it in the description. But thank you again, especially for the suggestions and prompting me to try the Grey variant. It was a load of fun. Please let me know what you think below in the comments. Check out the other video too if you're interested, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.